Um, very good. Just picking up where we left off last time, and this isn't yet Aristotle, but there is I mentioned, discussion in political science that certainly picked up steam in the 1990s. I think it had some antecedent perhaps in the 80s and then in the early 2000s, and a past president of the American Political Science Association who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania named Rogers Smith, a major figure in the discipline, Rogers with an S at the end of his first name, poses this question in one of his shorter articles: should political science, or the study of politics, be more scientific or more about politics? And you might say that there are two broad camps there, and they're not completely or entirely mutually exclusive. One camp says it should be scientifically rigorous, and then we ask, what do we mean by scientistic political science or scientific political science? What do they have in mind when they say that when folks say it should be scientific? And it should be scientific wherever the scientific outcome or wherever the scientific study of politics leads, whatever conclusions it reaches, right? There are others, we can call this the politics group, who say it's not to say that the scientific study of politics doesn't matter, but it shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be something like aiding the regime, providing counsel, helping the regime, providing advice to, for instance, insofar as you say, well, this is good policy and here's why, you're less in the scientific camp and more in the politics camp, right? Insofar as you say, this is the kind of citizen we need and we should be forming them this way, you're more in the politics camp than the scientific camp. So there's a group that says, listen, the study of political science should be more about politics than scientific, i.e. it should focus on things like what policies are good and what laws are good for the regime, and what does it mean to be a good statesman and what does it mean to be a good citizen. And you might call that the more political approach. And the scientific camp says, we want a scientific examination of politics, even if the conclusions we reach deeply subvert the regime and undermine it. Maybe make bad citizens if they study it, or study what we've taught. And so the scientific camp says, well, you can't put constraints on scientific examination, and that's what it should be. It should be simply about the scientific study of political order, and that means there are not normative or moral constraints on that. Now, whether or not that's a good approach to science in general is a question that ought to be raised too, I think. But before we get, I think we'll certainly cycle back to this question as the semester proceeds, and especially as we get toward the conclusion with Jim Caesar, but this is a question that will reemerge. We'll even cycle back to it a little bit today, but first I want to ask if we were to answer with the scientists, as it were, those who take the approach that it should be scientific, what do we mean by science? That is, what is science? And boy, is that a loaded question, if ever there was one. That's because I presume you know enough about science to know that scientists don't actually agree about what science is, or if there's one thing called science. I know, you hear the pronouncement. According to science, there is no such thing as science. There are scientists who reach particular conclusions, right? Cycle that around. Or at least that's one way you might approach this, and that is that there's no like oracle called science, or equivalent to a deity called science out there making pronouncements, right? This is what science once and for all teaches. I'm not sure if science once and for all teaches much. But if I pose the question to you all, just at a general level, what do you take science to be? What is the word? You hear the word science. What does it mean to you? Yeah.
Francis Bacon.
Francis Bacon. So after you've signed that, send that back around so that I can. And remind me of your name as we go through. Arthur. Francis Bacon.
Yeah.
Who's Francis Bacon?
The Baconian methods developed in the 17th century.
Okay, so he's an Englishman. He's writing in the 1600s. What methods are attributed to him?
Scientific methods of induction.
Okay. What's induction?
Induction, well, you can never reach clarity by using induction. Clarity can only, complete accuracy and clarity can only be generated by deduction. But induction is a study of the physical world using data points
Okay.
to come up with general trends,
It's moving to general claims based on specific observations aggregated, or something along those lines, right? You move, all birds of a certain sort have this particular feature that we move to a generalization about crows, or something like that, or ravens. Maybe you didn't know this, ravens are ridiculously smart. So far as the animal world is concerned, there is a unbridgeable, so got this wrong, an unbridgeable qualitative difference between human beings when it comes to thought and language and other animals. And Noam Chomsky, who set out to prove that there's no such thing, ended up proving that there's an infinite gap. He ended up writing a book on language, Why Only Us? And why you can't actually build the human language by just small building blocks. He meant to prove the opposite. I disagree with Noam about all sorts of things, but he's a fantastic scholar of language, maybe the best American scholar of language in the last century. He's just very, very gifted. It's also interesting to see physicists like Steve Barr quantify this stuff. Okay, so Francis Bacon is a figure at the beginning of the so-called scientific revolution. When is that? The 17th century. Maybe a little bit late 16th century, right, early 17th century. Really the modern period begins in some way, most historians have thought. We put it right at the end of the Renaissance, at the end of the 15th century, or more aptly, usually at the beginning of the 16th century. Martin Luther was educated in a way of thinking called the Via Moderna. Via Moderna, the modern way. He detested something that we'll talk about over the course of the next 2 weeks called medieval scholasticism, or the main stream of medieval scholasticism, which was the synthesis of Aristotle and Christianity. Luther, of course, was a Christian, but one of the things that he detested was the fusion of Aristotle with Christianity, and he thought to break that up. Almost all of the major scientific revolutionaries of the next century simply follow Martin Luther in that. They are the descendants or heirs, rightly or wrongly, of Martin Luther on that question. That is, the scientific revolution as they understood it. I'm not saying that it need be just understood this way, but as they understood it, involved a repudiation of the Aristotle-Christianity synthesis. Not for them in the name of rejecting Christianity, but for them in the name of rejecting Aristotle, actually, who we're going to talk about today, right? But Francis Bacon really hated Aristotle. Thomas Hobbes, who's maybe a more important figure in the advent of modernity, maybe hated him even more. The irony, of course, is that when it comes to the inductive approach to certain things and thinking through induction to general principles and deduction from general principles, or what we might call abduction. I know it looks like kidnapping, but that's the abduction, induction plus deduction. Aristotle is the progenitor of that approach. I'm never sure Francis Bacon completely thought that all the way through. He can roll over in his grave if he wants to. But one camp focuses on observation then, and seeks to reach generalizations. And we might have here the idea of hypothesis formulation and testing, right, to see if it holds up by means of further observations. And in political science especially, not political science only, but this went hand in hand with quantification. You might say that in the English world and in the world of the scientific revolution is probably the one I know best. I know something about the French and Italian worlds there, but and in histories of science there is probably an excessive English bias in the scientific revolution. That is, Spain and France get short shrift, arguably, in the 20th century histories of science that have been written. But the Royal Society, with respect to science, belonged there, right? I mentioned there was this big debate between two groups. The $1 million word that you don't need to worry about is corpuscularist, or corpuscularist plural, corpuscularism, and anti-corpuscularist. The corpuscularist held a view that is a lot like atomism in ancient Greece, that reality is built of these basic particles that oscillate in void space. And if this is your understanding of science, then you seek to prove either that idea or its plausibility. How? Observationally, experimentally, right? So who's a major figure here? His name is Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle conducted a series of experiments to prove that you could, that there are, and that he could create vacuums. Now, vacuums meant no air, and we think of vacuums and we think of outer space, but he's thinking of inner space. But to prove corpuscularism is plausible, what do you need to show? You need to show that there are vacuums, that vacuums are plausible, right? So he just seeks to show, he creates a very famous pump, very famous cylinders. There's a whole book about the debate between Thomas Hobbes and Robert Boyle over the vacuum pump in the 17th century and whether or not Boyle really created vacuums. And why was he trying to create vacuums? Well, to show that it's plausible to hold that material reality is built of ultimately tiny particles that oscillate in void space. That most of reality, physical reality, is vacuums, right? And he's trying to get at that experimentally. So Robert Boyle is a major figure here. And the Royal Society in England tends in this direction. That is one group. And I didn't bring the book with me this time. You can get most of the chapters online, and I'll link to some of them coming up a few weeks down the road. Alan Zuckerman, I think he's passed on now. If not, he is in his retiring years. Wrote a book that was aimed for his undergraduates at Brown, but I've always thought that as an approach to political science as a discipline, it's a very good book, and that its scope is broader than that. In fact, I wouldn't assign it to undergraduates today, to tell you the truth. I don't think it would go very well. It's called Doing Political Science. And if it's a little dated in some ways, I still think it's a good way to enter in. That is, he doesn't get into multiple regression analysis. On the statistics front, we won't do that in this class. I know how to, or knew how to do that at some point, but it's not my main thing. I did PhD level stats with Sam and Lynn, so something he did. And maybe some of you will be into statistical analysis, and if you do, you build to it. But it's good to begin thinking about it in simpler terms or easier terms as an introduction. And we'll do that here. Have any of you had statistics at the undergraduate level? Got 1, 2, 3. That's what some of you, but not everyone. Okay. So anyways, Alan Zuckerman calls these folks the empiricists. I'm always a little hesitant about that language because empiricism belongs to an area of philosophy called theory of knowledge, and empiricism doesn't mean, as we'll talk about with Thomas Hobbes, observation and experimentation. Hobbes is an empiricist. His approach to science is not observational and it is not experimental. Hobbes is an empiricist because he thinks that everything we know is the product of experienced reflection on it. But for the empiricists, though they say there's an external world, but they hold this except for David Hume, the empiricists also hold, I say except for David Hume. Bishop Berkeley was a kind of empiricist and an idealist. Let's set that aside. John Locke's an empiricist. Thomas Hobbes is an empiricist. Empiricists don't hold that we have direct access to the external world. It's Aristotle and Aristotle's medieval followers who hold that we can have some direct apprehension of the external world. For Hobbes, we can infer that it exists, but we can't directly apprehend it, right? And we'll get into that. So I'd be hesitant to use it, but a lot of people use the word this way when they're in the realm of science. So we're going to make a distinction. When we're talking about, if you will, theory of knowledge, we get to Hobbes in just a little while, not today or next time, but when we get to Hobbes and I describe him as an empiricist, I don't mean in this sense, okay? Here, what Zuckerman means by empiricist is those who are involved in observational political science, and there is a focus on mathematics and quantification. That also means that you would want a lot of instances, or what they call large N studies, large number studies, a lot of instances. Okay. We can also call this group the experimentalists, if you will. They're certainly interested in, I would put that, hypothesis testing means experiments, or gathering observations somehow, and then putting a hypothesis we formulated to the test. For instance, we might say, well, some people, maybe even a lot of people vote, and they vote in various ways. Why do they vote the way that they vote? And we may posit some hypotheses, right? We might say, well, the way that they vote because of, well, because of job, because of where they live, because of how their parents voted. And we might put together a number of different hypotheses and then seek to test those, right? Against other hypotheses, or shall we say, at the same time we're testing hypotheses. That is, we want to know if, when it comes to how people vote, whether, well, they're where they live or how their parents voted, how those fare against each other, and not just, if you will, by themselves. We just take how do they vote, and well, we just have a correlation. You know, if people with high wealth vote one way, people with lower wealth vote another. That's just a correlation. The question is whether or not that correlation withstands examination. And a lot of initial correlations don't. A lot of things that are raw correlations, the moment you test it against some other possible cause, vanishes, sometimes quite counterintuitively. You get why I don't like media reporting on this stuff, don't you? Media reporting on this stuff only ever reports correlations, and they might report like within a margin of error or something like that if they can bring themselves to do that, but even that is not the same as real statistics. Okay, observation. What's the other approach? The other approach Zuckerman calls, the other group he calls the theorists. The theorists. They think of, this is how I put it, science in terms of deterministic causal laws that duly qualified admit of no exceptions. So here we are looking at deterministic causal laws. Or perhaps we are talking about stipulating necessary and sufficient conditions. That is a set of conditions that are each necessary and for something to happen, and when they together hold or are together, they're enough to make something happen, right? So what does it take to get rain falling to the ground? And one answer is you need a certain density of moisture in the sky, right? But is that enough? That's necessary. It's not sufficient, right? If you live in Texas long enough, you will see the most threatening clouds, the thickest humidity, the heaviest skies do nothing, sometimes in the midst of a drought, where you would shake the rain from the sky if you could, and it looks like it is about to break, and it's not, it doesn't. And why is that? There's no disturbance. You need some kind of atmospheric disturbance in addition to simplify all of this grossly. Okay. Or think about it this way too. Think about like the laws of thermodynamics. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest, right? That a certain kind of action will produce an equal and opposite reaction. Or entropy, things tend towards disorder or something along the think of those things, right? Those are said to be laws of what? Just when apples fall to the ground? It's supposed to be laws that explain a small body like an apple, right? And a big body like a planet. And a really big body like a Jupiter or something like that. And though somebody like Newton took the universe to be created, on the one hand, he also took it to be infinite on the other. And maybe he was kind of apocalyptic, so maybe he thought the universe would someday end and those laws would go into abeyance. But until it did, if you will, those laws always hold. They're universal. They are all other things equal for Newton, right? Because he believes that they hold in unless something with due power that's immaterial, like God or an angelic being, acts on it, and then it's not all other things equal. And he's very clear about this in his work. He says these are. He doesn't frame these as later, especially French, and then as it moves elsewhere. He doesn't stipulate these in like they're almost moral. They can't ever be broken by anyone, or anything like that. He doesn't think that if God makes it so that all other things are not equal, that he's violated the law of nature or something along those lines. He would have thought that was crazy, crazy talk, as far as he was concerned. But he thought that nevertheless they were all other things equal, and it really would take something like God to act on them. Universals. Now here's the thing about that. Are they as universals observable? He thinks they're really laws and we can come to know them. Yeah? But the answer is no. Unless you're God and have a God's eye view, you haven't a chance in hell of observing or on purely inductive grounds arriving at the first, second, third law of thermodynamics. You'd have to exist at every place at every moment to have the requisite observation to say, here is a law that unless God acts on it, holds always. But you'd have to be an infinite being to know that. So Newton doesn't tend to think of science in purely observational terms. It's not that observation isn't relevant, but he postulates causal laws that cannot be, for us, the product of mere observation. And so, yes, he's looking at mathematics. He and Leibniz separately accuse each other of ripping the other off, discover calculus, and what's Newton looking at? To a degree, Leibniz too, when they discover and invent calculus. they're in need of a new mathematics to explain the motion of planetary bodies, especially planetary bodies post-Kepler that are not perfectly circular without the ellipses that somebody like Galileo puts in, but that are, I've forgotten the proper word, they're ovals at any rate, elliptical, ellipses. But now we need a new math, right? So it's mathematics, but it's not quantification. That's not quite how calculus works. Okay, so, but wherever Newton comes down, I mentioned Einstein last time. Alan Zuckerman puts it this way. Einstein was a theorist, not an experimentalist, preferring the precision of mathematical proofs to the vagaries of empirical tests. The criterion is simply this: the theory must not contradict empirical fact. That is, he's not moving from empirical observation to general principles. Rather, he says, here's how the mathematics works out, and as long as it doesn't contradict an empirical fact, good enough. Empirical observation doesn't drive what's being reached for Einstein. Think about this. Think about relativity. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Isaac Watts or the mini-series on Einstein that was produced on. It was fun, as far as that goes, I guess. But did any of you see that, or have any of you read Watts' biography of Einstein? The way they did this in the theory is, in the series, trying to capture how Einstein came up with relativity, and he's thinking about a lightning strike, and he thinks about a person on a platform observing the strike versus a person on a train in motion, right? And when and how the strike and all of that is relative rather than fixed, and he begins to generate a theory of relativity that might explain why, if I'm in the car and moving along, I can throw this up and it's just moving along forward rather than flying backwards, right? You say, well, he begins by thinking about an observer or two observers looking at a lightning strike and how it is different relative to their position, fixed platform, moving train. But no one could be that observer, right? So for Einstein, relativity is generated not by, the theory is generated not by empirical observation.
I've got a question.
Hold it for just a second.
Yeah.
And then I'll cycle back to you. Okay, so this position, says Zuckerman, rests on the principle that cognition precedes observation. And we might say that cognition, that you have some cognitive grid in place when you're observing and shapes observation. Einstein, we must be able to tell how nature functions, know the natural laws, at least in practical terms, before we can claim to have observed. That's Einstein. Einstein, therefore, says Zuckerman, did not place much store in the role of experiments or in the work of experimental physicists. He thought rather low of experimental physics. He's a physicist. But, thus, Einstein's attitude was perhaps best expressed in a remark reported to me by one of his colleagues in Berlin. Einstein once told me in the lab, you make experiments, I make theories. Do you know the difference? A theory is something nobody believes except the person who made it, while an experiment is something everybody believes except the person who made it. That's tongue-in-cheek for Einstein. As a result, Einstein, says Zuckerman, would ignore empirical findings that ran counter to his theory, even though the experimental facts seemed clearly to favor the theory of his opponents. Einstein found the limited scope and ad hoc character of their theories more significant and objectionable than the apparent disagreement between his own theory and the new results of experimental measurements. In Einstein's view, says Zuckerman, test results, even predictions of heretofore unknown events, cannot determine the truth value of a theory. although his fame spread when he was acclaimed for having predicted an eclipse as a derivation of his general theory of relativity. He himself was much less impressed by his own feat, F-E-A-T. According to Stephen G. Bush, in Prediction and Theory Evaluation, the case of light bending, published in Science in 1989, Einstein, though pleased by the eclipse results, gave them little weight as evidence for his theory. According to his student Ilse Rosenthal Schneider, after showing her a cable he received from Arthur Eddington about the measurements, Einstein remarked, "But I knew the theory was correct." When she asked what he would have done if the prediction had not been confirmed, he said, "I would have been sorry for the dear Lord. The theory is correct." Later he wrote, "I do not by any means find the chief significance of the general theory of relativity in the fact that it has predicted a few minute observable facts, but rather in the simplicity of its foundation and its logical consistency." I mean, that's a whole approach to science. We're going to see that is very much an echo of two figures in the 17th century. René Descartes, but we will focus on as it applies to politics, Thomas Hobbes. Okay. Query.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So the first question you were asking, what do we mean by science? Well, what do you think about this simple statement? Science is any statement that can be falsified, by Karl Popper. Wouldn't you think that?
He says that.
Wouldn't you think
I guess it depends on what falsification means. Do you all know the idea of falsification? It means something that can be shown to be false, right? But then we have to raise the question of what are the criteria or standards for showing something to be false, for instance. And in the world of science, if we're talking about things of significance, it's often very hard to show anything completely and entirely false, right? I guess there may be some things out there. But I think for me the question is not should something be falsifiable, but by what standard, right? And I think that's in other words, I'm not sure. You could be in either of these camps and insist on a certain standard of falsification, I think. Right? I think that Einstein thinks his theories are falsifiable by the standards of logical and mathematical cohesion. Right? He would say mathematical simplicity and elegance and logical cohesion are standards of falsifiability, or showing whether something's false or not. And I think that he would say empirical observation alone can rarely show a theory to be false. Tommy Kuhn, in his work on scientific paradigms, Tommy coined the phrase scientific paradigms, or coined the phrase paradigm shift, I think, actually. Says that you don't really get a paradigm shift until you have a lot of accumulation of anomalies, right? So you have a theory and it makes predictions, and you start to get some anomalies, and you start to get some anomalies, and you start to get some anomalies, and eventually get enough anomalies that it adds up to throwing the paradigm out, right? But you never have, as far as Kuhn is concerned, or you rarely have, as far as Tommy Kuhn is concerned, if A then B, not B, therefore not A. It's rarely that clear in matters of science. So consider for a moment, what were the two models of the universe in contention in the, let's say the 1500s and 1600s? Two models of the cosmos. Yeah.
Heliocentric and Merwin-centric.
Heliocentric and geocentric. Note please that there are no flat earthers in there, right? Ever since the pre-Socratics, every educated person, including every educated person in a medieval university, the Middle Ages invented the university, has believed the Earth to be a sphere, and has believed the nearest star to be as a mathematical point when it comes to the relation of the distance between the Earth and it, which is to say they've all held the Earth as a sphere and the cosmos is vast. So it's not like all of a sudden we're like, oh, hey, we discovered the cosmos is vast. No. But the main difference was, okay, geocentrism. Note also that that does not mean anything anthropocentric. Whether we're talking Aristotle or the medieval view of things, if you will, the Earth is the place of variance or change, or at the center of the Earth on some medieval model, something like hell, if you will, it's the heavens where perfection is, right? The geocentric model. And the best expression of the geocentric model was a guy named Ptolemy, silent P at the beginning of his name, right? Who's famous for his almscast, a work on this. Now, what's the other model? Heliocentric. Yeah, which the first proponents of which were also in the among the pre-Socratics. The sun is at the center, right? In the Middle Ages, they knew given motion, and they would say relative to your position and motion, there were several scholastics that said, you know, from a purely theoretical matter, it could be either. It's a matter of purely theoretical science. It could be either geocentric or heliocentric, strictly mathematically, which I've always found interesting. Okay. As the heliocentric model is emerging, was presented at the Vatican twice by Copernicus and rather well received by the time of Galileo. Galileo and the Pope did not get along. The irony is the Pope wanted Galileo to stick in his volume that he hadn't proven this. And he hadn't. Galileo did not prove the heliocentric model of the universe. Johann Kepler, Galileo detested, but was a much better scientist than Galileo did prove it, right? But Galileo did not. Galileo didn't really improve on Copernicus either. Yay, Jupiter has moons. It doesn't actually tell you that everything goes around the sun rather than the other way around. And Galileo was terrible at math. Einstein, that's a myth. Einstein was great at math. Galileo hated math and hated detail observation. So, he comes up with this sort of new, we might call this mechanistic philosophy system. It's a two-world system. The medieval view that I don't like and this. But when it comes to his model of the solar system, he just recapitulates the Copernican model, right? He doesn't improve on it in any way. And he adds that he's got some observations through the telescope. All right, so we have the Copernican model. I hold Copernicus in high regard. On the one hand, and we have the geocentric model with its roots in Aristotle on the other, but that's as exemplified by Ptolemy, right? Initially, the geocentric model of Aristotle not only, if you will, saves the appearances, right? It looks like the sun goes up and the sun goes down and all that. Not only and it looks like goes around us rather than we around it. Not only saves the appearances, as it were, but it's more successfully predictive. It's more predictive than the heliocentric model until Kepler. Why is that? Well, because Copernicus didn't know exactly how to work out all of this, and so he said, well, the orbits of the planets are still perfectly circular. That doesn't conform to observations exactly, does it? So he spoke of these things called epicycles, these little, as they're making these perfect circles, these little extra cycles in them. And when you, if you will, if you draw up or mathematically describe these posited epicycles accurately enough, predicts where the planets are going to be, right? Has real predictive value, even though it's wrong, because the planets don't actually go in perfectly circular orbits or make these little extra epicycles, but Galileo preserved that. And so for a bit of time, the Ptolemaic geocentric model outperforms and outpredicts the heliocentric model until Kepler and the idea of planets as ellipses. What does that tell you, by the way? You're looking at this and you're saying, well, there are... It's not the case that once you say, hey, let's make this big switch and put the sun at the center, all falls together and all of a sudden it's more predictive and you say, hey, right? Rather, the geocentric model is displaced because of, as Tommy Kuhn would put this, gathering anomalies. And those anomalies come to us best through the Lutheran Johann Kepler, wildly eccentric, fantastic. He's interesting to read about. Johann Kepler is savant with mathematics and detailed observation in a way that Galileo was not. And he notices some things. And eventually we get to a heliocentric model that's more predictive, but not initially. Right? And so it's not just like rapid displacement of one by the other, and it's not just observational or what appears. You might say initially when the heliocentric model is adopted, but make some false predictions because you're still preserving these cycles and epicycles, right? And as you get to the detailed, granular level observation, it's making some false predictions. And meanwhile, the geocentric model is more accurate predictively, right? You might have said, if it's just observation, the heliocentric model has been falsified, and the geocentric model withstands. Normal science, as Ed Grant, and here I disagree with Thomas Kuhn and the scientific revolution. Normal science, as Ed Grant describes it, is a matter of slow progress, and the scientific revolution wasn't an abrupt change, as people tend to describe it. It was actually normal science moving through slow development. That's another story. That's less fun. Except it upends the narrative, right? That's interesting. Okay, let me add that in the realm of politics, we might also speak of those who talk about micro-foundational or macro-foundational analysis. And both of these groups, especially early on, and there's a little bit of a synthesis between them eventually, but if we're talking about the early behavioralists, and as we were talking about the rational choice theorists of political science, this is the behavioralist, this is the rational choice theorist. These folks tend to be what we might call micro-foundational. Both of these camps tend to be micro-foundational analysis. There are people in both camps that don't fit that description, so I don't mean that to be a universal, right? But especially by and large initially. That is, they're looking at individuals, and they're looking at the behavioralists are looking at attitudes and values and the subconscious pre-political causes of individual political behavior that when you add it up, get us to an outcome like a national vote in the election of a certain party, right? Or a certain policy adopted in Congress or something like that. You say, okay, what are they trying to find? Trying to find the ultimate cause. What is the ultimate cause? The behavior of individuals. What determines that? Fixed subconscious attitudes and values. And down here, with deterministic causal laws, you say, yeah, we're still trying to get to the explanation of individual behavior as accounting for outcomes, and we're looking at self-interest maximization, or eventually preference maximization, or something like that. Over and against that are institutionalists. There are some institutionalists in this camp too, who say, but not all institutionalists are in that camp, who say we are looking at the macro causes, something bigger than the individual, like what? Institutions. Or they'll give us the idea of a political structure, a kind of institutional structure. It's the way different institutions in society relate to each other. That's good. Anybody know what an institution is? About to start Aristotle. Anybody know what an institution is? It's an institution. this is a lot of these guys at the micro level tend to treat institutions as arenas in which outcomes are aggregated. So, Supreme Court's an institution. The American federal judiciary is an institution. Congress is an institution, right? The presidency and the executive branch is an institution. A church or a congregation is an institution. A family is an institution. A township is an institution. And it can get broader than that. Some people speak of norms or rules of governance, for instance, as institutions. A soccer league is an institution. A professional guild is an institution. Right? And institutionalists say it's all these different institutions interacting with each other. It's not always for good in a given institution or in how it relates to other institutions. Sometimes it's a bad thing, sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's always a little bit plus and minus and then on balance. But it's these institutions that produce political outcomes. I mean, if an institutionalist looking at the macro causes would say, you know, it's partly what determines what Congress does is the institution of Congress. Because the institution of Congress outlasts all the individuals who are in it. The institution perdures. Individuals come and go. Even if they're not permanent. Okay. Now, that's how some of these folks think about science as applied to politics. They think about science in those terms. We asked a little bit at the end last time what's politics. We'll do that a little bit this time with Aristotle. Let me give you on what is science one more way of thinking about it, an older conception. The English word science derives from the Latin word scientia, S-C-I-E-N-T-I-A, which is the Latin equivalent of the Greek word episteme. Could also be translated knowledge. So it was that in earlier uses of science or scientia, long before our time, we have medievals speaking of the science of theology. In fact, theology was said to be the queen of the sciences, and philosophy its handmaiden. Metaphysics was described as a science. Logic was described as a science. As well, note, what we call science or the hard sciences today would have in the 17th century not been called sciences, but natural philosophy. It would have been called natural philosophy. It's only when you get to the 19th century, really latter 19th century, then into the 20th century, that what was natural philosophy begins to be called science, natural science, or physical science. What were natural philosophy, or what belonged to natural philosophy in the 17th century, eventually came to be called the physical sciences. The physical, perhaps recognizing that there was also the science of theology. The word physical comes from the Greek physis, which means nature or essence. That's actually relevant. We'll come back to that. So, is there a better way to think about science? In a way that we might then be able to think of political science or the study of politics as a science, of logic as a science, or physics or biology, without getting into the game of the so-called hard sciences, which end up ranking themselves. I've always thought that was kind of silly, right? At the moment you can say hard sciences, some sciences are harder sciences than others. If you run across a mathematician, like my father-in-law, they'll tell you that there's only one pure science, it's mathematics. In fact, he will tell you the story of when he was an undergraduate, and his advisor was initially a physicist, and his physicist advisor, trying to recruit him to physics, said to him, you know, you're very good at math, you should do physics. To which he replied, I see. And do you need math for physics? And he says, the professor of physics says, well, absolutely, you can't do physics without math. And he says, I see, that's very interesting. And then he looked at him and said, you have to have a lot of chutzpah, probably some hubris to pull this off, I suspect. Looked at him and said, and do you need physics to do math? He said the guy never replied. The answer is quite obviously no, you don't, right? Pure mathematicians tend to think, pure mathematics, probability theory, which isn't pure mathematics, which they still consider way above statistics, applied mathematics, the highest of which is physics, chemistry, biology, they have this sort of rank order to it. I've never thought, and then they'll say, well, the social sciences aren't really sciences at all. I've never thought that this was a good or useful way of thinking about things, though. I think that the idea of science from the Middle Ages, or episteme from ancient Greece, is the notion of an ordered, organized, a rationally organized body of knowledge. A rationally organized body of knowledge in which one proceeds from first principles, maybe, and that doesn't rule out some induction, maybe some induction to get to general principles, but maybe also there are in every body of knowledge, for instance, in the realm of what Aristotle would call theoria, as this theory as distinguished from phronesis, or prudence, or wisdom, the very first principles of logic, right? The very first principles and the most basic principles of logic are not things that you can prove. They're not things that you observe. They're not inductive. They are beginning points. But you can't deny them. They're undeniable. You can't deny them without assuming them to be true and universally valid. But you can't try to prove them without begging the question. That is, without also assuming them to be true. They're beginning points. The first principles of logic are. So, in which we proceed by means of rational inference from principles to conclusions. And if we're just talking about an ordered or organized body of knowledge that involves things like principles and conclusions, then of course you might say there is such a thing as an episteme in Greek, or scientia, of metaphysics, ethics, politics, physics, biology, chemistry, mathematics, or geometry. Okay. I think that's a good way to begin. And Alan Zuckerman also makes a point that maybe one will revisit, that not only different sciences, but different areas of different sciences employ different methods according to what they're studying. And that doesn't make them non-scientific because their methods vary. Methods should fit the what's being studied, should fit the subject. All right. That by way of thinking about science. Let's move to Aristotle. Who is Aristotle? Who's heard of Aristotle before? Yeah, well, two hands over here at the same time. What you went last time, you go. Yeah. And remind me your names, by the way. Sophia. Isabel.
Arthur.
Yeah, go.
Aristotle was a Greek philosopher, a prominent one, and but the interesting thing is that the only records of him is the manuscripts, not necessarily actually written work.
Yeah. So we have what amount to his lecture notes. Who did Aristotle study with? Plato. Yeah. Who did Aristotle allegedly tutor?
Alexander
the Great. There's actually some debate. Most people think the story is true that he tutored Alexander. But you have a major figure too, like Richard Kraut, who I think maybe not. So Aristotle, this is by way of a quick background. Just so we know who we're talking about, and then we'll get into his thought. He was born in Stygira, which is in northern Greece. So that's sort of, it's on the Chalcidic Peninsula, and it's over towards, or it's in the general area of Macedonia. Macedonia and Stygira, in contrast to the Greek world to their south, don't have cities. Macedonia is not a city; it's not a polis, right? It's an area. Stygira is a city, but it's not an independent city. It's not like Athens or Corinth or Sparta or something like that. Aristotle was born in 384 BC, and not in Athens, so he'd spent a lot of his life there, not all of it. His father, Nicomachus, was the court physician to the Macedonian king Amyntas III, who was the grandfather to Alexander the Great. At the age of 17, maybe 18, he left Macedonia for Athens and joined Plato's academy to pursue philosophy and science, Philosophia and Episteme, and he remained in Plato's academy for 20 years until Plato died in 347 BC. Or maybe he left just before Plato's death, depends on who you ask. With anti-Macedonian sentiment on the rise in Athens, Aristotle decamped to Artanius, a polis in Asia Minor that was ruled by his good friend Hermaeus, who was commonly referred to as the Tyrannos of Artanius. Tyrannos is one of the two Greek words for monarch. The other is Basilius, often translated king. Tyrant wasn't always a bad thing. Aristotle begins to systematically use it as an abusive rule by the one. However, he was very good friends with Hermaeus and would never have used Tyrannos pejoratively in reference to him. Among other things, he married Hermaeus' niece, Pythias. And in 343, when his good friend Hermaeus was assassinated, Aristotle composed a poem that, according to A.E. Taylor, quote, set forth the godlikeness of virtue as illustrated by the life of his friend. After Hermaeus' death, Aristotle left Artanius from Macedonia, where, according to Taylor, he became tutor to Alexander. Some say he was recalled at this time, son of Philip II, from 343 to 340, about a 7-year period. Richard Kraut, who's a major Aristotle scholar and classical scholar, finds historical evidence for the claim that Aristotle tutored Alexander Slim. Other scholars, like Taylor, George Klosko, and Carl Richard, accept the ancient story as true. But even if it's true, Aristotle's teachings seem to have had no impact on Alexander's thinking or character. Upon the assassination of Philip II in 336 BC, court drama in Macedonia, Alexander became king of Macedonia, and Aristotle left Macedonia to return to Athens. Aristotle's return coincided with the vacancy in leadership at Plato's academy. Upon Plato's death, his nephew, Speusippus, had been installed as head of the school. But Plato's nephew died about the time Aristotle returned to Athens, and Aristotle may have hoped this time to be installed as head of the academy, as he hoped with Plato's death. He was, however, as Taylor notes, passed over. The academy elected Xenocrates of Chalcedon as its new president, and so in 335 Aristotle established his own school in another of Athens' gymnasia outside the walled polis in the Lyceum, and so the school was called the Lyceum. Instruction was delivered from a peripetos in the Lyceum, which is a covered portico of the gymnasium, and thus Aristotle's school of thought came to be called peripatetic, adherent to it peripatetics. You don't have to know that, but if you've heard the word Aristotle called peripatetic, what does that mean? It is compared and contrasted to Stoicism, right, which is a later development, also because of where the teaching was from the Stoa, or the porch. With Stoicism, maybe you think of Roman Stoicism, it actually begins in Greece, right? Or Epicureanism, sometimes you hear of Peripateticism, or something along those lines. It just refers to Aristotle's school or way approach over and against those others. Aristotle taught at the Lyceum 12 years. But with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, strong anti-Macedonian sentiment again emerging in Athens. Despite Aristotle's lack of sympathy with Alexander's ideals, and what many scholars believe to be his antipathy to monarchy, he nevertheless found himself indicted on the charge of impiety. The basis of the indictment was that poem he wrote upon his friend Hermaeus' death on the godlikeness of virtue, which everyone took it to be on the godlikeness of virtue as exemplified by Hermaeus, which is the godlike Hermaeus. And so they accused Aristotle of impiety for the deification of his friend. In the ancient Greek world and in Athens, the two highest crimes, in witness whereof, whether or not an indictment was referred to the jury, was determined in the court of the king Archon, which was not really a king at that point in time, but two things. Two preeminent charges: homicide and impiety. Taylor, whom I admire as a great classical philosopher, greater command in classical antiquity than me, says that the charge of impiety was only a pretext. The real offense was political and lay in Aristotle's connection with the Macedonian leader Antipater and with the death of Alexander, who had conquered Athens. Anti-Macedonian sentiment on the rise. However, this is one point where I disagree with Taylor and have perhaps studied some things in the ancient Near East a little more to see, or scholars, to study some scholars that he would have to see something perhaps that he didn't, which is that in the ancient world there would have been no distinction in the ancient Greek world, no distinction between the religious and the political. So the notion of a religious cover of a really political indictment or charge, right? Who was indicted for impiety before this? Socrates. Indicted and executed, right, on the charge of impiety. Not acknowledging the gods the city acknowledges, introducing new divine things, and the indictment excludes it, but I think that it probably, and thereby corrupting the youth. And it's commonly said by scholars who I think that don't know better, that was, a religious cover for what was really a political charge. And one of the guys indicting Socrates doubtless had personal motivation. His son had been following Socrates. He didn't like it. He told his son to stop it, and his son became a drunk and a layabout and no good after that. And so he had a personal axe to grind, as it were. But again, nobody in the ancient world distinguished the religious and the political. The ancient languages don't do this at all. And so the idea of a religious pretext for a political charge is unthinkable in the context of antiquity. That's the kind of distinction and the kind of way we think. But we ought not read that back in. So I think that impiety may really have been in play, or that these things were not viewed as so far apart. Aristotle, knowing what happened to his teacher's teacher, Plato's teacher was Socrates, said that he would not allow Athens to sin against philosophy twice, and he fled before standing trial to the city of Chalcis, which was the mother city of Stagira, the here was a colony of Kelsey's, the city of his birth. And he died the next year at the age of 62 or 63. I hate that. Don't do that. Get on. Stop it. According to ancient accounts, the Aristotelian corpus was extensive. One ancient writer put the number of Aristotle's composition at 400, towards the low end. Another at 1,000. We have 47 pieces. If you get the complete Aristotle in small print and thin pages from Princeton University Press, it's 2 volumes. You know, they're about this tall, this thick. And I guess that looks substantial, but compared to what the Aristotelian corpus was, it's a small selection. In contrast to Plato's extant works, where we have well-crafted dialogues intended for the public, some scholars note, although I note that when Plato writes and when his teacher Socrates is alive, there is this big debate between whether writing or memorization and speeches is the way to go, and writing would have actually been accessible to far fewer than public speeches and memorized speeches. So I've never been sure what's the inside and what's the outside, or that we clearly know that. But what we have are Plato's published works, as it were, his dialogues, and we don't have any notes from lectures inside the academia, inside the academy. We don't have any notes from his students. With Aristotle, who wrote apparently beautiful dialogues that were considered, like Plato's, masterpieces of literary composition, described by Marcus Tullius Cicero, the Roman statesman and philosopher, as possessing golden eloquence. We have not one of those. Everything we have of Aristotle is notes from inside the Lyceum. So in Plato we have the dialogues and none of the teachings, none of the notes that might have been taken down. With Aristotle we have only the notes from what's been proposed and none of the dialogues. The dialogues were still around a few hundred years after his life. Marcus Tullius Cicero in Athens or Alexandria ran across them. Cicero spent some time in Athens, so yeah. One set of notes, the Nicomachean Ethics. This is the best edition. I have one copy of this at home and one here, translated by Martin Ostwald. This is my beat-up copy from graduate school. The Nicomachean Ethics is both the first treatise on ethics that we have, and a redaction or an edited compilation by Aristotle's son, Nicomachus, named for Aristotle's father. Okay. There is one piece of writing from Aristotle that appears to have been intended not only for students at the Lyceum, but also for the public at large. In recent years, writes Taylor, 50, 60 years ago, quote, but this is still accurate, we have recovered from the sands of Egypt. Maybe you don't know this. A lot of interesting stuff in classical, biblical, classical Greek and Roman and biblical thought has come from a dump of papyri manuscripts in this area in Egypt. And among the things that were discovered there was the Lyceum, or Aristotle's Constitution of Athens. We know that Aristotle and his students at the Lyceum analyzed and detailed the constitutions of 158 Greek cities. And we've lost all of them. Or, if you will, they were all gone until, I'm trying to remember when this discovery was. Early 20th century, late 19th century. We recovered this. It sits today in 2 lengthy scrolls with the pieces missing at the British Library. Different than the British Museum, different building. It's over by King's Cross Station. But we believe that Aristotle's politics, in other words, we think Aristotle said something like this for the Lyceum. We want to truly study politics. We're going to look at all these different constitutions. We're going to classify them. We're going to catalog their history. We're going to use constitution in the broad sense, not just the arrangement of governing offices, but also that, and the evolution of those offices, and the way of life, and the polis as a whole. And we're going to get down everything we can in as much detail, with as much historical development and contemporaneous description of as many polities as we can. And they got 158, and then he said, okay, let's classify them. Let's organize them in order to analyze them. Aristotle is looking at the Greek polis, the Greek city. But as Aristotle examines the Greek city, as Fred Miller notes, according to Fred Miller, in Nature, Justice, and Rights in Aristotle's Politics, each polis was a microcosm, geographically distinct and to a significant extent economically self-sufficient, politically independent. But as Aristotle composed his Politics examining the Greek cities, the age of the Greek polis was drawing to an end. King Philip of Macedon defeated an alliance of Greek city-states led by Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chirona in 338 BC, a disaster that the Greeks described as, quote, fatal to liberty, unquote, and asserted hegemony over most of Greece. And even though Philip will be succeeded by Alexander, Alexander will eventually fall. Instead of the reemergence of the polis, we will have Alexander's dominions divided up into various contending Greek kingdoms that will then mostly find themselves conquered by Rome as it rises. Okay, that's background for Aristotle. Because his political science applies his philosophy and it connects to his ethics, I want to say something about his political science and his philosophy and his ethics. Briefly on his philosophy, he is famous for laying out four causes to understand anything. In Aristotle's work, he looks back at a group of philosophers that we call pre-Socratics, that are really the beginnings of natural philosophy before the sort of collapse of pre-Socratic philosophy and the rise of the sophists. But our first natural scientists in some ways, natural scientists. And really, philosophy begins, or natural philosophy, natural science, begins in a Greek colony on the western coast of Turkey, or Anatolia as it was called. The name of the colony is Miletus, and the group of thinkers there are called Milesians, right? And as generally, the explanation of why things happen we might put under the heading of mythos, or myth. By myth, I don't mean a fake story, as people misuse the word today. Mythos actually originally means sacred story. And rather than using it as equivalent to fiction, I'm going to leave it open. Maybe some sacred story or other is true. I'm bracketing all that, right? It just means sacred story. However, if you have a sacred story explanation of things, how does that go? Well, if there is thunder and lightning, Zeus is throwing his thunderbolts, perhaps, right? If some side prevails in war, maybe it's because certain gods marched with them. The Romans famously would not march into battle or lay siege unless the sacred chickens had been consulted. I kid you not. I mean, the Romans. maybe until the United States, certainly until the British Empire, the foremost empire in the history of the world. And before they moved into battle, must ask the sacred chickens. Right? Empire while it was a republic. I mean, there was a Roman general who once didn't. I believe he probably had their necks wrong, but at any rate, he had them tossed into the river because he got tired of waiting on the sacred chickens. And the battle went very, very badly. And a Roman general, so far as we know, never failed to consult the sacred chickens after that, right? You say, oh, that sounds silly. The Romans also did this ritual before they laid siege to a city, in which they implored the gods of the city to abandon it and fight with them. Which most of the cities Rome thought must have happened. I'm sure they thought it happened because, of course, what happened? They fell. Rome won. Sometimes against long odds, based on the brilliance of its generals. Okay, so, why do things happen in war? You might say, well, certain gods marched with one side and not with the other, or Zeus held up the balance and the scale fell one way, right? And a guy named Thales was not in love with that explanation, and so he sought it in what's come to be called philosophy. I think it has a broader meaning than just that, but he wanted to know. We look at the river, we look at the river delta, and we notice that it changes shape, right? We look at water, and we notice that it changes into a solid, ice, or into steam. Why does change happen? And knowing that if change can be explained, then there must be something that does not change, even as it changes, right? Because you don't have change unless something is constant. You just have one damn thing after another, as it were, and it's not intelligible. If there is change, there must be something that remains. He says, there must be a basic stuff. What is it? And he looked to Greek myth, and he says, well, according to the myth, the sacred stories, reality is made up of four basic things: earth, wind, fire, water. Or earth, air, fire, and water. And he said, I think the basic stuff is water. Right? Somebody comes after him and says, no, I don't think it's water. I think maybe it's air. I think it's fire. Someone else comes after and says, the basic stuff can't be fire or water or anything like that, because fire and water are opposites. Right? And so he called it the boundless. It was an unlimited, unknowable something or other. Incomprehensible. And others said, that doesn't sound like a good explanation at all. But what were they looking for? They were looking for what we might call the natural causes of natural phenomena. And we call this whole group of thinkers pre-Socratics. They also include the question of, is change the ultimate reality? Or is change the basic reality, we might say? Heraclitus said that change is the basic reality. There's something more ultimate. Logos is more ultimate for Heraclitus. And there was also someone named Parmenides who says, no. And Zeno, following Parmenides, Zeno did, by the way, write to, you've heard of Zeno's paradoxes? Those are not supposed to be paradoxes. I don't know why maybe in the older Greek. They're not really paradoxes. Those are Zeno's reductio ad absurdum arguments, showing that the idea of change is absurd. That motion is impossible. That motion would be moving from being to non-being, but there's no place where being is not. That was Parmenides' position, and Zeno wrote to show it was true. That change and motion are just illusions. You know how Zeno does that, right? I mean, there's sort of two ways that we might do it. You've heard of the race of the tortoise and the hare, right? How does that go? The tortoise goes first and the hare goes second. And can the hare ever catch the tortoise? Presuming we can get anybody to go in a straight line and there's really a race going on, all kinds of givens that won't happen in reality. But can the hare? It looks like the hare catches the tortoise and zips beyond it. I mean, tortoises do not move fast. They're fantastic creatures. The wife, widow of my former best friend, I certainly, not too long after Jeff died, spent some time in the Galapagos, hanging out with seals and tortoises. I was very jealous. Tortoises are fantastic. It looks like the hare goes zipping by. And Zeno says, no, no, no. The hare can never catch the tortoise. Because every time that the hare gets to where the tortoise was, it gets to where the tortoise was, and the tortoise has moved on. And it can't catch the tortoise without getting to where the tortoise was, but the tortoise has always moved on. What's he doing there? He's trying to show that motion is impossible, right? Or to go to that wall, I have to go half the distance. To go half the distance, I have to go half the distance. To go half the distance, I have to go. You know how long you can divide points? Ad infinitum. And here's something: an infinity, an actual infinity, can't be traversed because it always involves going an infinite amount first. Actual infinites are non-traversable. So there's this whole sort of crisis. Well, Aristotle looks at that and he says, you know, the pre-Socratic project didn't arrive at any definite conclusions. It arrived at a lot of confusion. Part of what Aristophanes is up to in his play Clouds about Socrates is not only a criticism of the sophists, but a criticism of what we might call the nature philosophers, because they have toppled Zeus from his throne and chaos rules. Aristotle says, yeah, they went wrong in a lot of ways. And he has this whole survey of this. He says, where did they go wrong? And he says, well, I think that they tended to explain things in terms of only two causes. That when we look at those two causes alone are insufficient to actually explain it. We need more than two. He said, what causes is he talking about? Well, he said, here was their question. What is the material cause? What's it made out of? Or what's the ultimate stuff? Is it water? Is it earth? Is it fire? Right? Is it some indeterminate something or other? Is it pure being that has no gaps, as it will? Or is it Democritus's infinite variety and number of atoms that oscillate in void space, and the world and people as we have them are just the accidental coincidence of some atoms? That's the material cause. And we might also say, we get more approximate, that sort of ultimate, I talk about marble, stone, flesh, things like that. All right? And then they also spoke about the efficient cause. How something comes to be. How something comes to be. Or that which brings it to be the way that it is. And suppose we were talking about Michelangelo's sculpture of David. Michelangelo didn't pick the block as it happened. Somebody else was going to sculpt it first. That's not a very good block, as a result of which the ankles are weak. If you think you have seen the actual David in Florence outside the town square, that's not the real one. The real one's in a museum. It needs all kinds of supports and things like that. It's a brilliant sculpture out of not a great block of marble. But if we were to ask, if you will, what's the material cause, right? We'd say, well, okay, it's marble. We might want to get more precise. We might want to get to atoms and electrons and protons, or maybe even subatomic particles or something like that. But it's marble. Okay, what do we mean by efficient cause? And here we must mean something like the action of the chisel on the marble, and of the mallet on the chisel, and of the arm moving the mallet, and of the muscles moving the arm, right? Aristotle says the philosophers before Socrates that were examining, beginning with the Milesians, that were examining the natural causes of things, end up in a deadlock, and pre-Socratic philosophy ends up stalled because they relied only on these two causes. And that's not enough to really tell us what something is, what it's made out of, and where it comes from. Don't get me wrong, that's essential to telling us what something is. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Aristotle said we need to posit at least two more. Formal, and here he tended to use the Greek word morphe. Sometimes Plato would use that as equivalent to idea or ideal. There are two Greek words that are close to that. Idea is one of them, actually. But the formal cause, and perhaps we had the Latin in front of us, quidditas, quiddity in English, less technical. Whatness. What is it? Just telling us what something is made of and how it came to be doesn't tell us what it is. If you say that's marble and it came from the chisel and the mallet and the arm and the muscles, that doesn't tell us what it is. Right? So what is Michelangelo's David? What is the form that it has? And the answer is it's supposed to be a kind of representation of the form of a human being and a particular man. Now, it can't quite literally have that form predicated of it, because if it did, it would walk around and reason and require nutrition and expel waste and things like that. It does none of those things, right? So it doesn't really have the form of a man, but it's supposed to be a kind of representation of that, and a representation of some image of David in Michelangelo's mind. But even that is not enough, says Aristotle. We also need to know the final cause, or the telos of the thing. And here we are getting at whyness, as it were. I'm ripping that off Donald Palmer, who's both a wonderful historian of philosophy and a cartoonist. And he combines those in a book that people are thinking, you recommend this book? Yes. College students? Yes. Graduate and undergraduate. Why? He doesn't always get it right, but he's a very good historian of philosophy, and he's a very good illustrator and cartoonist, and he makes it sort of jump off the page. The book in question is Looking at Philosophy, subtitled "The Unbearable Heaviness of Philosophy Made Lighter," which is a riff on the unbearable lightness of being. And you say that sounds like a tortured riff. It is. And how can I appreciate a tortured riff? I once titled an article, "Why Liberalism Fails as an Account of the American Regime." So that's a tortured title too. I don't think Pat Dade liked it very much, but I don't care. Because he's wrong. And he may be an endowed chair at Notre Dame, but I'm a better student of the founding than he is. In fact, we spent more time studying it. Did I say that out loud? It would be false humility to say that it was false. All right. Patrick. Aristotle says we need to add. So, what's the whyness then? The whatness is just sort of metaphorically here for the statue of David as the form of a man. What's the whyness? Well, something like beautification. Notice, by the way, difference in form is why we are able to say that things made out of the same stuff are nevertheless different in important respects. For instance, my dogs are made out of the same stuff I am. I am not a dog. You are not a dog. You're made out of the same stuff dolphins are, but you're not an orca. Right? What? How can you have things made out of the same stuff, but they're different things? And the answer is they have different forms, says Aristotle. At the same time, how can you have the same thing, or the same form, but it's not just one form? That is a form of humanity. Why is there just one human? Why is there more than one human? And he says, well, that's because although it is a particular human being is made out of the same stuff as a different human being, it's the same material, as it were. It's not the same matter. That is, you have matter that's your own, and so it's distinct matter. Matter is this principle of distinction. That is, you have matter that is you're human, and you're human. Why aren't you just one human? And the answer is, well, you have different matter, right? It's the same kind of matter, but it's different matter, right? And this way of thinking about things allows Aristotle to make some distinctions in classifying things that the pre-Socratics could not make. My word here is highlight. Okay. So if we look at the light bulb in this room, right? These are fluorescent lights. So what are they made out of? Well, among other things, glass, metal, and mercury. I mean, there's more than that there, but I never know what to do with this kind of light when it goes out. What do you do with it? It beats me. But glass, metal, and mercury. Mercury's toxic. Don't just go breaking them and sending them to the dump. All right. But what is, just to say, you probably use glass, metal, mercury. You can use all these parts to make something else, right? Glass, metal, mercury, and make a thermometer or something along those lines. You have all these different parts. That's the matter it's made out of, and you might be able to explain how it came to be. You got a production line or something like that, but that it doesn't tell you what it is. I mean, you still have to get at the whatness, right? We say it's the form of a light. It's something that provides it. Like the sun provides light. The fire provides light. It's a light providing kind of thing, right? That's the function it performs, and that gets that sometimes form and final clause can bleed into each other. That's what it's for. It's to provide light for the room, the light bulb, right? That's its telos. That's its telos. That's its purpose. Its proper function. Now, sometimes folks call this Aristotle's metaphysics, and he treats that in the metaphysics. But this is also really his physics, his causal theory. The Greek word, our word physics comes from physis. It means the nature of things, and so he's trying to get at the essence or the nature of things. So this is Aristotle's physics. We might want to add to this the idea of substance. A substance is a particular thing. What is a substance? It is matter or material cause plus form. So, an oak tree is the union of particular matter and particular form, and it's a substance. It's one substantial thing, right? A squirrel, as a human being, is a union of a particular form, the form of human and particular matter. And so anything that exists. Now, Aristotle thinks that we can think of pure matter purely theoretically, but we never encounter pure matter. We only encounter things or substances. So when we speak of a thing, it's a substance. We only encounter informed things in the world. There are no uninformed things. Pure matter is not a reality. And notice what this is, by the way. When we move to modernity, the moderns begin to speak of spiritual substance and material substance, right? And some of them might end up materialist. First, some of them are dualist. But the point is that Aristotle thinks of substance very differently. Substance is a union of matter and form. There's no such thing as material substance. Matter is part of the substance. Even if it's, pure matter is purely theoretically possible. It's nothing that you'll ever encounter or experience. And one other part, and then we'll take our break, and we'll come back, and we'll get into his ethics and the first part of his politics. We'll do regime classification, next time. What I want to get at right here is the act potency distinction. This is going to help us think about Aristotle's ethics and his politics, because he thinks about both in these terms. And then as we move to modernity, you have to understand maybe the central tendency of modernity as a rejection of these terms. That is, modernity is not a positive assertion of anything. It's a kind of rejection of things. Think of potency as potentiality or potential. And think of act as actuality, even though I've given you the usual philosophical terminology here. The form of a thing contains inbuilt or inherent potencies or potentialities that can then be actualized. For instance, a rubber ball has the potential to bounce. Yes? Bouncing is the actualization of that potential. The ball has a spherical shape. It's the sort of thing, the rubber ball, that will bounce and so forth, even before it is, and we might say that rubber has the potential to be made into a ball that will bounce, even before it's made into that. And this distinguishes rubber from water. We can't make water into a bouncy ball. I mean, just try to make water into a basketball and see what happens, right? Or a baseball. Take some water and make it into a baseball, and my star pitcher is going to send that at about 104 miles an hour. So it's crazy. It's not doable. What are you talking about? The water doesn't have that potential, right? The material that goes into a baseball does. Okay, so certain things have certain kinds of potential. A car doesn't have the potential to become an oak tree if you plant it in the ground, but an acorn does. In fact, an acorn is the oak potentially because it has the form of the oak, but it is not a realized or actualized form of the oak. And the oak is the acorn actualized in act. Motion, as Aristotle understands it, is the actualization of the inbuilt potential of something. It is movement from potentiality to actuality. The infant is not a full-blown, mature adult. The infant has the potential to be a full-blown, mature adult. Both the infant and the adult are human beings, but the infant is not an adult human being, right? It has the potential for that. The adult human being is that potential realized or actualized. And motion is the movement. This movement, by the way, I've described it with the oak, as something that occurs in time, but it need not be chronological. It could be simultaneous, right? Think about this. The different tissues in my body have the potential to be me here and now, speaking and moving as a unified human being. And that potential is simultaneously being actualized here and now. Okay. So when we explain things in Aristotle, and you see, this is how this comes in and this comes in. Potential is inbuilt into the form. The actualization of it is the telos. The oak is the telos of the acorn. And motion is motion from inbuilt potential in the form to its continuous. That's how Aristotle thinks of things. And that is among the things, precisely the things that Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes mean to reject as well. Now, I say let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back, we'll do Aristotle's Ethics. Maybe you've heard something about... So we have different manuscripts that come down. So Plato talks about probably the guardians, so rulers and warriors, having everything in common.
Yeah, seriously.
Meals, housing, spouses, children. You have to, so that you don't have incest, you have to have like cohorts to avoid this kind of thing. But he says, some had interpreted them, even in his own day, to think, oh no, the whole polis should have everything in common.
It's not.
And Aristotle says, whether he's talking about just the guardian class or the polis as a whole, this is a really crappy way of seeing that things are taken care of. He says anything is better taken care of when it is owned by a particular person than when it's owned by everyone. This is very interesting, and Mansur Olson, logic of collective action is like, yep. Goes from there. It's fascinating. All right, Aristotle's Ethics. We begin with this question, and it ties very much to what you saw at the beginning of politics, and in particular, chapter 2. I almost said book 2. That would have thrown you way off. What is that? Chapter 2 of book 1, where he talks about the highest good. And I'm going to try to use the phrase highest good rather than greatest good, because if you hear me say greatest good and you think Jeremy Bentham, greatest good for the greatest number, or pleasure maximization and pain minimization, you will have missed what Aristotle means by the highest good completely. This is not the greatest good for the greatest number. All right. So he asked. He says in chapter 2 of book 1 that the polis is that association that exists for the preservation of, for the promotion of the highest good. The highest good. And we have to ask, what does he mean by that? Well, to get a sense of that, we have to turn back to his ethics. And there is a question in the ethics that is this. Is there a highest good? And I realize you shouldn't compound questions like this. If so, what is it? And first we have to get a sense of the kind of question that we're asking here. What does it mean to say of a good that it's the highest good? And Aristotle says, well, the highest good, if we're asking, is there a highest good, or what is the highest good, what are we asking about? And suppose we were to survey people, what would we be asking them about? He says, well, we'd be asking something like this. Is there a good that is desirable and desired for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else? And everything else that we desire, or should desire, we desire for it. So that the highest good would have the nature of a final end. There's nothing beyond it. We are saying principally here that if there is such a good, that it is non-instrumental. Think for a moment then of what I mean when I call a good instrumental, right? A nail is an instrumental good, and so is a hammer. That is, they're entirely instrumental. I mean, I guess if you made the nail out of gold, or you made a really aesthetic hammer, what a beautiful hammer! It's just a work of art. Do you think that way? I mean, when I feel the weight of the hammer, I don't think, what symmetry? I think, yeah, that's about right for swinging, hitting the nail, and not smashing my thumb, right? Or about right for the amount of effort that's going to go into nailing something, right? That you want a hammer that's balanced so that it's not nothing, but it's not too much work either, right? If you balance the thing wrong, it's going to go off course potentially. It's not going to drive. It's going to take too much effort to drive or what have you, right? But what am I thinking of in all those things? I'm not thinking of, well, this is just sort of a weighting that is intrinsically good. I'm thinking this is a useful weighting. The entire good or value of the hammer is what it's useful for. And so also a nail. We use nails to fasten things. I mean, I built a few good shelves in my life, but I'm pretty terrible as a carpenter, all in all. And my late friend Jeff, who died about 20 years ago today. No, 21 years ago today. Nope. How many years have I been here? He died 17 years ago today. Now I think about that. A brilliant molecular biologist. At some point when we were in high school together and we were in shop class, he said, we're going to build pyramid display cases. And I said, nope, I'm building the cabinet. Dance shop, woodworking shop. And he said, no, we're building this. And I'm building this and you're doing it with me. He was a pretty demanding personality all in all. And I don't know why I didn't say no, because I knew it was going to be too expensive. But I decided, there's like, if I do this, there's 4 of us doing this project. And oak base, plexiglass display, drawer with inverse sides, oak top. I've long referred to it as my postmodern impressionist display case, because that's how it came out. It's the only time I've ever in my life got an A for effort. Damn shop teacher forgot to keep the heater running in the shop building in Northeast Ohio during the winter over the weekend, and my wood warped. And then, this is how good a shop teacher he was. He tried to unwarp it by sticking it in vices. You know what you can't do with wood? You can't unwarp it. You know what you can't do with oak? You can't unwarp it, especially by sticking it in vices. You know what happens when you stick it in vices? It gets warped worse. My parents at some point are like, my dad's like, hey, we sold it in the garage sale for $25. And I thought, setting aside all the effort that went into that damn project, the wood alone was $150 in 1991. $25. I can't fasten things for the life of me. But that's what nails are good for, right? They're for fastening things. Their value is entirely what they're useful for. We call that instrumental value. When we ask if there's a highest good, according to Aristotle, we're asking if there is anything that it is of purely non-instrumental value. Maybe there are some things that are not only instrumentally good, a nail and a hammer, purely good for what you can use them for, right? They're purely instrumental. Maybe there are some things that are both instrumental and good in themselves. But when we ask about a highest good, we are asking about whether or not there's anything that is simply good in and of itself, for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else, that is non-instrumentally good. And if so, what is it? And here, Aristotle, I grant, people read him and say it can be kind of elitist. That may be true in places. Doubtless anybody at Plato's Lyceum, Plato's Academy or his Lyceum came from some kind of elite background at the time. I actually don't think he's as elitist as people think. But where does he begin? He begins in the Nicomachean Ethics with sort of surveying the common sense of the matter. He says, well, let's ask people. And he says, if we ask them, they say, yeah. We do think there's a highest good. I mean, if there is such a good, something good for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else, I don't know that we're going to have mathematical demonstrative proof of it, right? Maybe it's one of those things that's basic, and it's basic in the sense that you can grasp it and not on the basis of anything else, and you couldn't grasp it on the basis of anything else. He says, yeah, if we ask people, they'll say that there is, and then we ask them, well, what is it? And they'll say, is commonly translated, happiness. Actually, he says, they'll say, eudaimonia. Now, if I could only spell in Greek, there you go. Eudaimonia. You see the word daimon that has some almost sense of divinity to it, right? You could sometimes be translated well in Greek, right? There's one scholar I know who will translate this simply, instead of saying it means, will translate this simply as well-being. And I remember when I was an undergraduate in a philosophy class reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, among other things, that the professor now works for the Templeton Foundation said, well, this is what eudaimonia means. It means something like well-being with connotations of deity or something like that. A divine well-being almost. Divine well-being, a really high level of well-being. It almost transcends just human well-being. Eudaimonia. Pretty much every scholar that translates Aristotle's Politics renders it happiness. Happiness. Happiness is good for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. And Aristotle, so we've begun with sort of the common sense. Is there a greatest good, something, a highest good, something good for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else? Yes, what is it? That's eudaimonia. Great. Suppose we say we ask this question next. What is happiness? Or put this another way, in what does happiness or eudaimonia consist? And Aristotle says, well, that initial consensus vanishes. If we ask people, what is happiness? We begin to get all kinds of different answers. What do you suppose? If we ask people, what is happiness? Or in what does happiness consist? What do you suppose they tell us? What do they say to us? What do you say? Somebody on the street, apparently they film these things with cell phones now and ask questions, but probably most of those are crap or not worth watching. But here's what I'd watch if they were doing it. It would actually capture my attention. Somebody out on the street surveying people saying, you think there's like something that's good for its own sake and it's not useful for anything, it's good just because? By the way, here's something that I don't know that it's good, that it's the highest good, but here's an example of something that's good for its own sake or that you do for its own sake if you do it rightly. Play a football game. Play chess. Checkers. Act in a play. I can't stand it when you should have your kids involved in sports because it'll teach them teamwork. I'm like, that is the fastest way to teach them the wrong lesson and to ruin the thing. Yes, you have to have teamwork for a team sport to go well. But the point of the game is not so that you become good at teamwork and then can go be good at various projects as a member of a team. The purpose of the game is to play it. The purpose of the chess match is to play it. The purpose of the play is to perform it. I know, what a dinosaur. Everything I told my daughter is strong-willed. Turns out I'm strong-willed. I probably shouldn't have been her coach. Just like I probably shouldn't try to tell my youngest anything about voice, even though I'm a classically trained singer. Nevertheless, everything that I told her was not, hey, you need to be good at soccer because if you're good at soccer, you'll be good at other things because of it. It was, you want to play this game well, then you need to develop a certain skill set. You need to not only, she had quick versus speed, but you need to work on endurance. That means that you don't just stop when you're tired, you keep going, right? It's not about doing something else, but you learn to take a certain position on the field because that's good for the game. That's good for playing it well. Okay. Anyways, suppose we ask people what is happiness. Suppose you were I really would. If we had somebody on the street, I don't know, is this like social media feed, asking questions. Do you think there's something good for its own sake? And if so, what is it? Yeah? And they say that, and you get to happiness. That's fantastic. What's happiness? What do you say, or what do they say? Seriously, I'm going to add this as part of the experiment to this class at one point. Require you to go out on the streets. I'm not going to do it this year. Oh, come on.
I would totally do it.
Say what?
I would totally go and ask for you.
You should do it for extra credit.
I should do it for extra credit. You know what a lot of people would say? Pleasure. Not everybody would say pleasure. Some people would mean by pleasure the experience of pleasurable sensations. Some people would mean by pleasure the absence of painful ones. Some would mean a combination of that. Some might mean something like tranquility and quiet of soul, or something along those lines. There's a more elevated understanding of pleasure. There could be such a thing. Some would say pleasure. I bet there are a lot of people who, when they go to college, think it's going to be a good time. Why? I'm going to have lots of pleasure. I miss the days when I could have the pleasure of something like a Snickers bar, a Snickers bar without thinking about it, and not anymore. Maybe I should be vegan. I'm not. I really enjoy the filet mignon. And I make a really good filet mignon. The red wine shallow production. Very good. Yeah. Yeah. Some would say pleasure. Okay. I'm not going to watch the movie because I've seen the musical twice, and the musical is pretty good. And I've listened to the soundtrack, but I hear they're releasing the second part of Wicked as it happens, and there's a song among songs which Kristen Chenoweth was rather famous in the original production of it. Yes, something about wanting to be. Some people, if you ask them, Aristotle says that some people will say something like this: honor, fame, reputation. I'm surprised we haven't had this one. I think there are some people who will say money. I think of Michael Crawford singing, and the money kept rolling in from every side from his rendering of one of the songs in Evita.
But wouldn't money be instrumental?
Hold on to it. But if you ask some people, they'll say, "Wow," right? Or, not unrelatedly, they might say, health. They might say something along the lines of, you don't have anything if you don't have your health. Right? Or maybe they'll say, well, at least you've got your health. Aristotle calls these external, and with respect to health, bodily goods. And there are some who will just identify the good with that. Suppose we had a Roman Stoic in here. We're going to ask the Stoic. Cicero is sometimes misdescribed as a Stoic. I think he's closer to peripatetic like Aristotle. But Seneca was a Stoic. And what if we had a Stoic in here? What's good? And they would say,
virtue.
Now this comes from the Latin virtu or the Italian virtu, because anyways, the Greek is arete. And we could translate that word excellence. And we could have a broad understanding of it, any kind of excellence, right? But also a class of excellence is moral excellence. And so we can speak of moral virtue. So, does Aristotle think about these things? Well, first, he'd say that there is a grain of truth. Pleasure. No one would call a person happy who never experienced any pleasure at all. But, were he alive today, he might point us to that great philosopher, maybe just philosopher, Mick Jagger, who once famously sang, "I can't get no satisfaction. Did he mean he couldn't get pleasure? I mean, you've got to be kidding me, right? Go watch Rock of Ages. It did prove to me that whatever you think of Tom Cruise, he can maybe play anything in the world. I was always like, well, holy cow. Actually, his best movie is Valkyrie, where he plays Stauffenberg, Colonel Stauffenberg. It's yeah. Mick Jagger? Of course he had fun. He is not saying he couldn't get pleasure. The context here is a man who has experienced any kind of pleasure, in particular physical pleasure, you can imagine in droves. And he must mean something like this. In the midst of a life characterized by the experience of one pleasure after another, I can get satisfied. I'm unsatisfied. In fact, that's what we might expect. Unhappiness or dissatisfaction in the midst of pleasure is, as Aristotle notes, a common experience. And if unhappiness and dissatisfaction in the midst of pleasure is a common experience, then it follows that pleasure cannot be the highest good. Pleasure comes and goes. We think of true happiness as something enduring and something that characterizes the whole life. True happiness is something that characterizes the whole of life and is something enduring, abiding. So, if here's something interesting, by the way. Would you call someone happy who had never had any experience at all? Who had never experienced any pleasure at all? Socrates might have said yes to that. It's unclear. Some folks might have taken Socrates as saying yes to that. Aristotle is clearly not the case. In particular, if suppose it was there's only this life and you never had any pleasure, only pain, would you say when somebody died that they were happy, had well-being? And Aristotle thinks no. Suppose there's a next life and you had nothing but pain, and this one and the next one, no pleasure at all. Would you call such a person happy? He thinks no. But pleasure is not the center of eudaimonia. Rather, it's a kind of byproduct or accoutrement. That's the closest I'm going to get to correct French diction on anything this entire class. Right there. Even if I tried it again, I'm not sure it would go well. My whole life in music, somebody hands me a French score and I swear inside because I can't figure out French diction for the life of me. Italian, Latin, German, English, no problem. French, and I'm like, Anyway, all right. What about honor? There's a kind of grain here. Aristotle says you wouldn't call somebody happy who had never received any honor for their virtues, for their excellences. So suppose you have some real virtues, some real excellences, and you never get any honor for them. Or suppose you have, and that's not sort of the hubris thing where you think, I'm really great, but I'm not, I'm actually not that great. Or I'm really great at something. I didn't watch it much, but I used to think the great value of a show like the old version of American Idol were the people they put on who thought that they were incredible singers and weren't. It was just terrible at it. We're not talking about it. We're talking about like genuine virtues. Right? And yeah, we all get overlooked sometimes, but suppose you never had any honor. I just got a College of Liberal Arts Scholarship Achievement Award, and I had some years back Presidential Distinction one as well as a junior member of the faculty. And I found that rewarding. I've also applied for things in the course of a typical scholarly life, worthwhile scholarly life. You might apply for a lot of things and find yourself getting turned down, and found that hard sometimes, right? And I don't think it's all just vanity, perhaps. No, we want some recognition. Now, and maybe there's some I don't know how harmonizable or at distance Aristotle and the Christian tradition are. Here, Jesus of Nazareth says, if you do something good, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. Don't broadcast it. But then he says, but God will see what you do in secret. If people see it, you get your reward from people, and you won't get any reward from God. God alone sees it, and you'll be rewarded by God rather than by human beings, which he thinks that you would presumably want. But in that scenario, it's still somebody sees it. There's some reward for it, right? Suppose there was none at all. You had excellences. You exhibited them, and nothing. Would you be happy? Would you have well-being? And Aristotle thinks, no, probably not. But Aristotle thinks honor for its own sake isn't a real good, and even the honor seeker must admit that. Nobody really desires to be honored for excellences that they don't have. Or if you will, if we look at it from the inside, it's a hollow experience. We live in the age, I think we need a word that just doesn't designate this one way or the other, but people speak of the celebutant, but they're men, women, people famous for being famous, right? And what do we discover that they often do? They're famous, and you think, well, that'd be enough. But all of a sudden, they're in some kind of business deal, right? And they're on some show, and you should really be interested in my fashion line that I designed. It's really good. It's like they were famous for being famous, found out hollow, wanted to be famous for something worth doing. Fashion well done. Or, I was famous for being famous, and now all of a sudden I'm sort of a lobbyist against over-criminalization, or getting people out of jail who were falsely convicted or something like that, right? Well, why would somebody like, say, Kim Kardashian is part of a family who's famous for being famous, be interested in something like that? I think because the experience of being famous for being famous is hollow. And they really want to earn it somehow. And we can debate how well they really earned it or not, right? I'm only interested in the psychological dimension here, which is, I'm really recognized. I'm really celebrated. Might have my detractors, but I got a lot of followers. I kind of wish that meant something. How can it mean something? I have to merit it somehow, right? I have to do something good, something well. Okay. So what the honor seeker really wants, Aristotle thinks, deep down, is a moral psychology here, is to merit honor. But there's another problem here. If you never had any honor for your excellences, no, you wouldn't be happy. But honor doesn't in any way depend on you. It depends on the people who give it to you. The people who give you the spotlight, as it were, and can take it away. It depends on those who confer it. But we think of eudaimonia, or happiness, as something abiding, as something that's the possession of the person who has it, and as something that is difficult, at least, to take away. Even if we can, Aristotle says, only say someone had happiness or eudaimonia at the end of life, looking back over the course of the whole life. We wouldn't make the pronouncement, if you will, before they died. Now, they might have genuinely experienced it, but we would say, oh yes, well, this is a life well lived, this is eudaimonia, until we could look at the whole thing. But what about external goods, or bodily goods? What about health and wealth? Well, the grain seems to be that eudaimonia does have some dependency on outward conditions, right? External conditions seem to matter to some degree, but they're, again, not at the center. What do we say about wealth? Aristotle says, well, he doesn't add this part, like a hammer, is only good for what you can do with it. It's purely instrumental. And something must have gone wrong in the moral reasoning the cognitive moral capacities of the person who thinks of wealth as an end in itself rather than an instrumental good. They have misunderstood things significantly in a way that also reflects how they live, right? And so when we think of somebody who likes wealth for its own sake, I mean, of course, I've not seen The Wolf of Wall Street. It beats me as if the wealth is good for its own sake and it comes off well or not. I have no idea. But I think that often we think of the person who seeks wealth as an end in itself as Ebenezer Scrooge. I once played Ebenezer Scrooge. Nobody saying we guessed that already. I once played Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, and I always thought the Scrooge ought to be remembered for his reclamation rather than his starting point, which is what Charles Dickens intended, really. But we think of him, at least at the starting point, as a miser, as stingy, and as somebody who has subordinated everything, for whatever the psychological reasons that led to it, to getting and holding on to wealth. Now, Aristotle thinks that you probably need a modicum of wealth to exercise a virtue like generosity, and certainly magnanimity. As it happens, Aristotle thinks that it is extremely hard to be virtuous, morally speaking, if you are extremely poor or if you are extremely rich. He thinks those pose sets of temptations that will pull one from. He doesn't say the middle class are virtuous. He says you tend to find the virtuous in the middle class, or those with a middling amount of wealth. Maybe there's some tension. I think there's probably room for a lot of synthesis, but some tension with the New Testament and the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor, in one version of that. But whether or not there's any tension there, Aristotle thinks you probably need a modicum of wealth. But a lot of wealth and too little wealth put you in the wrong direction. Wealth is not the good. Wealth is just good for what you can do with it. We might also say this. He doesn't exactly put it this way, but health is for the sake of life. I know there's some people who make life for the sake of health. I think health is a real good. I think if you're always suffering from health your whole life, that eudaimonia is probably hard. Although, allow me to say, I know some people who have suffered immensely for most of their life, who seem to exhibit eudaimonia, or even a higher level of well-being, more than most people who don't. So, I don't know. Maybe suffering is a real good in some ways, as philosopher Eleanor Stump suggests. But I tend to think of health, that is, suffering is not maybe not a good in its own sake. I tend to think of health as real health as good, right? Before COVID in 2019, before I had it, I had stellar blood sugar. In 2021, I was way over the line, type 2 diabetic, no movement, but I took 2 years off of physical because of COVID-19. I don't know if I should have done that or not, but would I rather not have it? The answer is yes. I'd rather not have it. I'd rather not think about it, right? I have cochlear hydrops, which means I have two tones, tinnitus, roaring, a sense of fullness in my left ear continuously. I will go home and be up for hours tonight because the sound will be so loud that I can't go to sleep. Wednesday night will be worse. I have choir practice after then. By the time that's done, it'll take a day to just sort of recalibrate sonically. Would I rather not have it? Oh, you better believe it. But health is for the sake of life. And life, Socrates reviewed, health is for the sake of life well lived. Health is an instrumental good. I think it is a higher level instrumental good than wealth, but it's an instrumental good. What about virtue? This comes closer to the truth of the matter. Unlike pleasure, virtue is abiding. That is, the person who really has it. Insofar as we are speaking of something that is habituated, formed, as it were, hard or deep-seated in one's character, it's abiding. Unlike honor, it cannot be simply taken away by others. situations and others can challenge your virtue, but it's not theirs to take from you. They don't give it to you, they can't take it. And we saw that the person who wanted honor really wanted to merit it. But how do you merit honor? And Aristotle says you merit something by virtue. It's virtue that determines merit. But now he says, imagine someone who is perfectly virtuous. And here he must have Book 2 of Plato's Republic in mind. And Glaucon's challenge to Socrates concerning justice, where Glaucon says, let's talk about two parallel lives. And one life is the life of the man who is consummately unjust. But the consummately unjust person pulls off the consummately unjust swindle. They acquire a reputation for justice and all the rewards that go with it. Office, wealth, choice of spouse, marry off your children to the best people, and you don't deserve it. And then Glaucon says, and let's contrast that with the perfectly just person. But to make sure that he's perfectly just, we have to make sure he chooses justice for its own sake and not for the consequences. So let's imagine somebody who is just, but saddled with a reputation for injustice, treated as if he were unjust, and so therefore punished, tortured, stretched on the rack, eyes gouged out, and says, Glaucon, ultimately crucified. Imagine then someone perfectly virtuous, by some dreadful mistake, condemned to torture for crimes he did not commit. In the very midst of his agony, is he happy? Does he have eudaimonia, well-being? Maybe. It depends on how one reads the Republic. Maybe Socrates says yes. Aristotle says no. No. Virtue is necessary for eudaimonia. Virtue is closer to the center of eudaimonia. And the virtues are non-instrumentally good. They are good for their own sake, but they are also instrumental goods. That's one point that we're going to get to. They're not simply non-instrumentally good. They're not simply good for their own sake. They're good for their own sake and for the sake of something. We'll come to that in a moment. But also, virtue alone is not enough. Apart from Socrates, I think the common Stoic answer would have been something like this. Yes, you have well-being if you have virtue and are tortured, even for it, because you have virtue, and virtue is well-being. And Aristotle says, no. No, virtue is at the center here. Virtue is centrally important. Virtue is absolutely necessary, maybe more so than anything else we've discussed is necessary for eudaimonia. But by itself, not enough. So then we have to, we don't have an answer. Good Lord, all this time and we don't have an answer yet? What is happiness? Well, happiness is the ultimate good. And Aristotle thinks that the good, so what is happiness? The highest good, right? So what is happiness? A good. And what is the happiness of something, like a human being? That which is good for it. And what is the good of a thing? Aristotle defines it in terms of, I already took this off the board, the telos, the final cause of a thing, which he associates with its proper function. And here Aristotle almost certainly assumes the account of proper function toward the end of Book 1 of Plato's Republic and the discussion between Socrates and Thrasymachus before Thrasymachus is by and large dismissed from the stage for the rest of Plato's Republic. You know who Thrasymachus is, right? Thrasymachus is the Greek sophist who, at the outset of Republic, famously says, and we think there's a historical person called Thrasymachus, and that he said something along these lines, because Plato doesn't name him in his last work, The Laws, but he describes the position. It's like, you can't bear naming Thrasymachus. Why do I have to deal with this position again? Sort of thing. But Thrasymachus says, justice is nothing but the interest of the stronger party. And Socrates says, oh, that's perfectly vague. What do you mean by that? And he says, what I mean is that in any polis, there is a contest for who will rule, and some group or other comes to rule, comes to have command, control of the instruments of power. And they lay down laws that they intend to be in their interest and to their advantage. And they say that keeping these laws is right, dike, just, and call anyone who breaks them a lawbreaker and idk, unjust. That's Thrasymachus. But in the course of that discussion, Socrates says, Thrasymachus, I don't think that's what justice is. I think justice is a virtue. And I think that the virtue of anything has to do with its proper function. And in particular, with doing its proper function well. So that for Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics, the good of a thing is to perform its proper function, and its highest good is to perform its proper function well, i.e. with excellence. And the virtue of a thing is that which helps it perform its proper function with excellence. In Book 1 of Republic, the question is raised, how do we figure out what is the proper function of anything? How do we know this? And I think this might be, as I think on this over time, that this might be a good sort of general rule. Maybe this works as a general rule. I don't think it's a perfect rule. Which is to say, I think it gives us false positive, probably take it as an absolute. But here's how the discussion works. How do you figure out the proper function of anything? Socrates tells Thrasymachus the proper function of something is that which it either does uniquely, that is that which it alone does, or that which it does better than anything else. Right? So, what is the proper function of the eye? We say, what does an eye uniquely do or do better than anything else? It sees. Only eyes see. In fact, whether we're talking about like primitive eyes in certain kinds of creatures, or more developed eyes like ours, whether we're talking about the eye of the octopus, octopi are fascinating creatures, aren't they? It's fantastic, wonderful. The eye of the octopus, I think they're really perceptive creatures too, or the human eye, or the eye of an orangutan, or a dog, or paper wasp. I was sad. I had to kill a paper wasp the other day in some bushes. Boy, did I almost get stung. The paper wasp will leave you alone. They're good environmentally, but the nest had to go. It was, anyway, I said, the paper wasp? Yeah, it's fascinating. And they're all pretty much similar, right? Eyes alone see. It's the unique function of an eye. Okay. What's the function of a knife? The cut, right? Now we could also say, what's the function of a pruning knife? It's to prune, right? Now, it's not the case that only pruning knives prune. Suppose you didn't have a pruning knife, right? You could take a steak knife to prune. You could take a dagger or a sword. I mean, I think it gets hard trying to prune with a sword, right? Or a dagger. I suppose you could take an axe, and you might tear up the house while you're trying to do that. I wouldn't recommend it. So, other things can prune, right? But a pruning knife prunes better than anything else, right? Now, if we generalize to a knife, say the purpose of a knife is to cut. then we might say, okay, what is the virtue of the knife? Notice we're not talking about moral virtue here. For the purpose of the eye is to see, we might say, what is the virtue of the eye? Well, let's go back to the knife. What is the virtue of anything? The virtue of anything is that which helps it perform its proper function, that which it uniquely does or does better than anything else well. What helps a knife cut well?
Sharpness.
Sharpness. Sharpness is the virtue of a knife. Likewise, we might say bluntness is a vice of the knife. It's not, you don't say, well, it's morally blameworthy and we should put it on trial, or censor it, or train it better. No, we say it's a blunt knife, we should just sharpen it, right? We're not talking about moral virtues here, just virtue in general. So the good of a knife consists in the ability to cut. Its highest good to cut well. Sharpness is what helps it cut well, right? So also then, clarity is what helps the eye to see well. And you say that, we know what that is. How do you spell that out? But think then of what the vices might be. The vices are things that include vision. So we can speak of detached retinas, dry eye, glaucomas, or things like that get in the way of the eye. See, he thinks about this about everything, right? And we could add today harps. I always think when you say, by the way, the teleological way, final cause way to think about things, and people say, well, modern science doesn't do that, and I say, oh yeah, medicine is what it does. What do you think about disease? What is heart disease? What does it do? It gets in the way of the proper function of the heart. How do they address heart disease? They try to restore proper function. Okay. So the virtue of anything is that which helps it perform its proper function well. The good of anything is performing its proper function. The proper function of anything, here I'm synthesizing a little bit Aristotle and Plato, the proper function of anything is that which it uniquely does or does better than anything else, and then we might ask ourselves, great, so the good of a human being, like anything else for Aristotle, will consist in performing the proper function of the human being with excellence. The virtues of the human being will be that which helps it perform its proper function well. And so then we have to ask ourselves, what is the proper function of the human being? Like we ask of the heart, or the kidney, or maybe with great puzzlement of the appendix. No, I'm sorry. Anyway, oh, come on. Lead balloon. Never mind. All right. So how do we get at that question? We say, well, what do humans do uniquely or better than anything else? Well, we say, well, first of all, Aristotle posited a deity that was thought pondering thought, an ultimate final cause. Let's bracket that. Let's bracket what we might call theology and just deal with substantial things, unities of form and matter, substances. First of all, we're substances. Is that what we're uniquely good at? What is the good of a substance? And Aristotle says, existing. A mountain's substance, right? The Icelandic shark is a substance. I said the Icelandic shark. The Icelandic crystal. That's very famous in the experiments of light wave particles and stuff, right? The Icelandic crystal. Oak tree is a substance. It seems that there are things that are as good at being substances or achieving the good of a substance, at least as good as we are, maybe better. I mean, what's that? The tortoise has lived 190 years. You know that Charles Darwin and Steve Irwin, so-called crocodile hunter, owned the same tortoise? All right. It's not substantial existence. Okay, we're not just substances, we're living substances. We take in nutrients, we expel waste, we grow and develop. Yes? So do oak trees. So do redwoods. You can go to Muir Woods and see some trees that are 800, 900 years old north of San Francisco. I mean, I hope they're still there, outlasting the last fire. Boy, in terms of living substances, they seem to live really well. I'd like to live as long as some of those redwoods in Northern California. I've seen an oak or two that are 1,000 years old, 2,000 years old. the one at the front, they think the one at the front of my neighborhood is, well, several years ago was already over 500 years old, older than the United States, older than the Protestant Reformation, older than the Scientific Revolution. Fantastic. It seems that other things live at least as well as we do. But we're not just living things, we're animals. You know, we move around. We can have and can rear young. We can have a kind of social life, even communicative social life. Of course, there are other animals that do that. Not necessarily talking about understanding, but just communication. My dogs communicate with each other. They can communicate pleasure and pain and emotions and things like that. And it seems that there are animals that do animal life as well as we do. Is there anything among living animal substances that sets us apart? And Aristotle says, well, yes. Reason. Understanding. He says other animals can express emotion, for instance. They can utter. But they don't have understanding. They can't seek and apprehend and communicate ideas of true and false, real and image, good and evil, just and unjust. I might say that hurts and don't do that. And I think, somebody that's beating a horse is a bad person. And I know that the horse doesn't like that. I know that one of my dogs who needs her nails trimmed really hates having her. I have two. One has to be sedated to have it done. And they can express that. They communicate that. A 100-pound dog who will get into the tiniest spaces not to have her feet clean. Right? I don't know if she was abused at some point before we got her or what. She's a sweet dog, but it's 100 pounds. She can communicate that, but she doesn't communicate ideas of right and wrong, true and untrue. She'll sit with me in the study, but I'm not having a conversation with her about, and I love that dog, fundamental philosophical and political theoretic things. Okay. So reason, and so Aristotle says that the good of the human soul or self lies in the activity of using and following reason, and its highest good in using and following reason well. Reason has two dimensions. Of reason, we have theoria. We get our word theory, theoretical. We can speak of theoretical reason. Some early translations of Aristotle render the speculative reason, and that is profoundly misleading for what we mean by this. The actual Greek word is theoria, right? And the other is phronesis, and it's sometimes translated prudence, but if you read Machiavelli on prudence into that, you'll misunderstand it. So I prefer to call these theoretical and practical reason. Theoretical and practical reason. And the virtues are what help us to do this. Now, as we're wrapping up, let me say this about moral virtue. Virtue is, and we'll say a little bit more about virtue next time, but then we'll get into the politics. The right act done the right way and done for the right reason. And while it is natural to come to have the virtues, we do not have them by nature. That is, they are not in us at the beginning. They must be trained and habituated. So that virtue is a matter of habit. It's not only a matter of habit, but it is a matter of proper habit. And Aristotle will tell you when kids are very young, they are not likely or to often do the right thing the right way for the right reason. That is, you usually have to wait until one has a certain level of maturity for the right reason to kick in and virtue to be full grown. It's not mere habit, but it's not less than habit. So, the question then for us as we start next time is, however, we haven't said anything about specific virtues. What are the virtues that help one to live well? And they will include the classical Greek virtues, but also things like friendship. And here's one way I can show you that the virtue is good. Sorry, things like friendliness. I said friendship, not friendship. Here's one way I can show you that a virtue is good for its own sake, but also instrumental. Friendliness is good for its own sake. But you wouldn't say that the virtue had achieved its goal if a person was friendly and had no friends. Friendliness is intrinsically good, but it is for the sake of friendship. Friendship is the good at which it aims, is good for its own sake, and not for the sake of anything else, and therefore constitutive of eudaimonia. Not the only thing that's constitutive of it, but it is essentially and partly constitutive of it. You must have friendliness, which is really good to have friendship, but if you have friendliness without friendship, you wouldn't say that you have really attained the good. Friendliness is for friendship. Friendship is part of well-being. Why does that matter? Because political order is for the sake of well-being and is a partnership in virtue. Politics is inherently normative because it's a partnership in well-being and therefore a community in which people look out with and are concerned with each other's excellences. It's a community, not a mere living side by side. All right, I went a little over, but it was worth it. How much? How often do you get insight?